That is the big designation that we have to understand, that a manager manages the status quo by and large, right? A leader creates change. And so change, of course, is uncomfortable, right? And in any case, it's uncomfortable. And, you're either going to make a change or you're going to be changed by someone else's change.
Hello, and welcome to ReedFlections, a podcast on life, leadership, and learning. I am Art Calderon. I'm here with Reed Nyffeler. Reed is a CEO of a growing global franchise security company, a father, a husband, a published author, a seasoned podcaster, and we've been talking about leadership and developing leaders for some time now. We talked about why developing leaders, who you should develop, what capacities do leaders need, where in the organization can they grow, how you should develop leaders. And in this section, we're going to be talking about leadership that lasts. Leadership that lasts. We're going to go through episodes 24, which we're currently in, all the way through 28. Create, regulate, accelerate, future state, triplicate. Nice wording. And currently today, create. Reed, give us an overview of why lasting leadership matters and what it takes to build it.
I think I would look at this as a follower first before a leader, because as a follower, we want stable environments. Because if we know where our next meal comes from, if we know where our water is going to come from, then we can build on top of that, right? If you look at destabilized countries, a lot of things, they have leadership changes, they have resource changes, et cetera. And in fact, recently I've been diving deep into legacies, or I would say cultures that haven't endured, right? And we can look at the Roman Empire as an example, right? I mean, they were a huge empire in the early centuries, right after the turn of the century, and really through 500 through 1500. And even before that, right, BC to AD. And what happened, what changed, right, is ultimately there was a leadership that didn't last, and many of those areas are still destabilized as a result of that because of the things that were there, whereas they were really growing because it was a stable group. And so that made me think, okay, what leads to leadership that lasts? And it's stability based on a clear vision that's unwavering, a clear mission that's unwavering, and then the clear core values, because technology evolves, people change, circumstances change, but those foundational and fundamental items should not change. And so leadership that lasts. And so you look at a present day organization that probably has executed that well, and I would say that's Chick-fil-A, right? Because even though Truett Cathy's long gone and they're actually on their third generation, their values have not changed. Right. However, if there was instability there, for example, Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays. If they had new ownership that opened on Sundays, something that simple, how would that change their culture? And then would that leadership last? If they, instead of saying my pleasure, they said thank you, like everyone else, it's just a super subtle change, but as they change their culture, would that last? And so if we're going to create things that last, we have to recognize that it's around vision, mission, and values predominantly, and that we want to hold that tight as a leader, and then we'll create it last. But if our values evolve, our vision and mission evolve, we're not creating an organization that lasts. So really, in this section of the podcast, and ultimately the book that's going to be forthcoming, there's really 5 stages to creating leadership that lasts, right? And the first one is creating. The next is we want to regulate, right? We got to make sure that that's consistent, just as using the Chick-fil-A. And then it's accelerate, right? Because once we have these consistent cadences and patterns, it'll accelerate the growth of leadership, right? If we know we have stability, right? We have these regulation of that stability, think water, then we can accelerate getting that plumbing to everybody, at which point then that creates a new future state, right? Now we can make ice, following the water analogy, or we can have hot showers and hot water heaters once we get the plumbing to the house, et cetera. And then triplicate, we can't even imagine life without it, right? If we look at how water has revolutionized human livelihoods, and then it's saying, okay, how do we build on top of that, right? And that is leadership that lasts, right? I believe 100 years from now, we'll have a form of plumbing, right? And ultimately, the society will be living on that, and even further advancements may be happening with regard to water over time as we look at those things. And so that's what leadership that lasts, making those critical decisions around foundational values and creating it based on that, then regulating to maintain those values throughout the organization, then accelerating on account of those values, and then the future state will be the culture will be a byproduct of those values, and at which point we want to make sure those values are generational from there, and that's the triplicate.
So leadership that lasts, you talk about that, but you also talk a lot about change. So when we say leadership that lasts, and we talk about the values that don't compromise and so forth, we're not talking about not changing, right? However, what I've known working for you for several years now is we're always changing, we're always evolving, and it's always a little bit uncomfortable for some people more than others. Why is that? Why are we uncomfortable changing?
Yeah. And so the term create, which is the theme of this podcast, you never create the status quo exists. And so if you are a leader, you are managing the status quo, you are creating, and that's going to force change. And so that is the big designation that we have to understand, that a manager manages the status quo by and large, right? A leader creates change. And so change, of course, is uncomfortable, right? And in any case, it's uncomfortable. And, you're either going to make a change or you're going to be changed by someone else's change. And so I remember telling my children as they were young, someone is deciding what's going to happen. So offer an idea. Don't just, float along in the status quo, offer an idea. And then change happens. And so in high school, I was a wrestler, and I was recounting this with my youngest son, who's 12 years old, and he started wrestling in his first time, and he's super sore. And he's played sports his entire life, but it was not wrestling. It was basketball, soccer, and running. And so now he was super sore. So I was saying, when I started wrestling, my neck was super sore. You're just using muscles you never used before. I said, however, now my foundational athletic base, whatever exists, is a little stronger as a result of that, because I was using different muscles at different times. I said, and it aided me in other sports as a result of that, right? And so that change of even my activity created pain, right, in the case of my muscles. And that is inherently what happens in an organization. If you change anything in an organization, that creates pain. And so then he's dreading going to practice, right? Because, I'm going to be even more sore the next day, and I don't get this break. I don't have that time to recover. And so that's part of this creating change, is you need to give the organization a time to recover, right? And using our muscles as an analogy, we can tear our muscles down, but if we don't give a chance for recovery, then we really won't be stronger. We'll actually be weaker because they're too broken down. And so that's the same thing we want to do when we create leadership that lasts. Don't have too frequent changes that it breaks the culture down, but do have an appropriate cadence of change that it builds that muscle. Because hypothetically, if we did use that muscle and we didn't use it for 2 to 3 weeks, our muscles have gone back to where they were before. So as a leader, creating change and maintaining change, it's important to understand the balance of when and how to do that, so you're not doing it too frequently and you're not doing it too infrequently. But either one of those, if you do that consistently, just like muscle building, over time, you'll see a result that'll benefit everyone.
An organization's purpose should be something that's enduring, right? It should transcend changes that happen. Tell us about a time where an organization did make a change that helped that purpose endure.
Yeah, so I, years ago, read this book. It was gifted to me by a franchisee at the time who had worked at UPS. And he was long-term in UPS, and I was always interested in founder stories. And so he had sent the book, and I had talked about it at one of our events. And he's like, I want to send you this book. And so he sent me this book, and it was actually the UPS founding story. And when I read the story, it was super intriguing because at the time, I believe it was in the Northwest, Portland or Washington, been some years since I've read the book. The founders, Ryan and Casey, they're Claude Ryan and Jim Casey, had a small bike business and a parts repair business. And then the advent of the vehicle, the car, the automobile was coming. And so this was the early 1900s. And they're like, well, our bike business is not going to be the primary mode of transportation, right? We're not in the horse and buggy business. We're in the bike business. And they were saying, but we're in the service business, right? We're not in the parts manufacturing business. We're in the service business.
That's a big mindset.
That's a
right?
mindset. What are we created for, right? Are we bike assemblers? Are we in the service business? And so then they recognized that, hey, we could make a little bit extra money by delivering the service, the parts or the bike, or returning the bike to the person, and also taking a basket of, I believe it was bread at the time, to the neighboring bakery. So imagine a small little bike shop that had somebody that needed a part for another bike shop. So they'd hop in their bike and ride that bike over to that particular bike shop and drop off this good. Well, there was a bakery right next door, and they needed daily bread delivered. And so they would deliver it back and forth, or whatever the case might be. And they got paid for it. And so pretty soon they're like, you know what? Our business model is shifting. This bike business may go away. I mean, people are going to probably get cars. It's just more feasible for them to do so. And our customers shrinking. There's so many bike shops. What are we going to do? And so they pivoted, they changed, and they said, we will be this service business. And so that was the beginning of UPS. They decided that pretty soon now the bikes were too small to bring all the goods they had need for. And then they began to build their UPS business. And so that was a change, right? We are bikes. All we know are bikes, right? And even at that similar time, as another story is, that's how the Wright brothers actually created a plane. They saw what they knew, right? They understood they were bike manufacturers, and they created a plane using a lot of the principles they understood of that as well. And so you can really see much of your change will be based upon what you already know to apply in a new way. It's not change of everything else. It's change of application of things you already know. In the case of UPS, going to a service-based business. In the case of the Wright brothers, going into their flight.
Now, changing just for the sake of changing is not good, right? I know that a lot of the changes here at the company that I work for, Signal, you run, always seems to be on the edge of challenges, always challenging. You talk about needing to rest so that you don't overload your people, but the change when it comes is always a little bit challenging for everybody. But you can overdo that, right? You can just decide, well, I'm going to change things up just for change's sake. That's not good. Now, why is that not good? How does that cause missteps?
Yeah, I think first thing as a leader is we should, and I always assess, is this a tension to manage, meaning I don't need to change anything, I just need to manage through the problem, or a problem to solve, right? That's where change needs to happen. So if it's a tension to manage, it's something like, okay, I don't need to change anything, I just need to grind it out. I need to get through it, right? If it's a problem to solve, I probably need to look at what I need to change. And so I think then if we're at that problem to solve, the mistakes, usually leadership mistakes, are because of ego changes, right? And so an example that reminded me of that, and back to the founder stories, and we're getting in many of those books, is I love my founder books. And so I toured the Coca-Cola museum, which is in Atlanta at one point as I was preparing for another message. And I saw a founder's book there. And it was the history of Coca-Cola. And they were one of the first franchisors, actually, and if not the very first modern day franchisor. And what I saw, and I read that through that story as I got to the 70s and 80s, they had changed their original recipe, right? That in the lock by, if you go to their museum, it's locked up still, kind of, nobody knew what this recipe was. And they had regulated, they kind of followed this whole cycle of these information because they're a very enduring brand. But in the 80s, a new leader came in and wanted to put their impression on the brand, right? I'm going to innovate and be new. And
this is the ego you're talking about, right?
This is the ego. So this is where their 80s debacle came in. And so he created the new Coke. We're going to get rid of our Coca-Cola, what it was before. I'm going to give a new recipe and everyone's going to love it. And it'll be new pricing methodology, new branding, et cetera, et cetera. And so ultimately then what happened was that new Coke was a huge, colossal failure, right? And
I actually remember that. You may not, but I actually remember that.
Yeah, well, you're probably opining with your team at that time, and so you've aged.
Well, thank you.
We'll leave it well or good or whatever from there. But nonetheless, that was a debacle, right? Because they were changing because this guy wanted to build his career, right? He wanted to be the guy that thought of the new Coke and see it wildly successful, and that was a mistake. However, the other thing is we can make a new decision. And so since then, what they learned from that, and so I think the only change that is a failure is the one we don't learn from, because I've made countless mistakes myself, but I learned from them. And so if they came with a new Coke, and again, right, that would have been a mistake. Instead, what they learned was, you know what, if we're going to have a new drink, have a new brand. And so as a result, and you can watch their portfolio in the 80s and 90s, and even now there's millions of drinks, right? Even bottled water with 10 different flavors of bottled water. I don't even know. But what they recognized, a new drink, label in a new way. And so when we're going to have a change, make sure it's comprehensive. Name, brand, image, process. And so that is critical learning from poor change. Never smart to make a change on ego. And if you're going to be changing something, label it in a new way so that the mind of the consumer can be rewired.
Talk about what that looked like for you creating Signal's brand. What was some new ideas that you brought to the security industry? Because that's what we do. We do physical security guards and so forth. Talk about how that applies in your history with Signal.
So back to where I started, I mean, there was not a need for more status quo. Right. And so what I researched was, what was the status quo? When I was starting the security franchise model, what was the status quo? Then inherently, I had to look at who I was, right? Because if I'm the leader and I want to create change that lasts, I'm likely my personality is going to be infused in the organization as every leader's, right? I mean, every family is largely influenced by their parents and their personality. And so I thought, okay, I want to help people help themselves, essentially. And that's franchising. And then I know
That was big, right?
That's huge.
Franchising?
That's huge. And it had never been done in the security industry, right? So that was before I thought of security. I definitely wanted to help people help themselves, and that's franchising. The second, I know that they cannot have an enduring business without a recurring monthly revenue model. And so I was looking at industries that have some sort of recurring monthly revenue. Literally in security, I mean, so you see franchising around food, right? So you eat 3 times a day, or at least I do. At least, right? And then that's a lot of food franchise concepts. And so that's every day, right? And so in the case of security, we're 24/7, 365, and global. So I thought, okay, now here's an industry. So the next thing I did is said, okay, this is franchisable and can create an enduring business. What is the status quo? And so, unfortunately, because we're taking a risk by starting a new business, we dive straight to doing the status quo slightly better. And when I say that is, we discount the status quo, or we add, we change the color of the status quo, meaning like, hey, I'll just add a new label on the front, right? The new Coke, said another way. Instead, I'm saying, no, we're going to invent a new category, right? And so that is what we decided to do. And so that was the change. And so in that new category, as I looked at the market, I saw a big security businesses that could cover the entire country and small security businesses that could cover their community. The big ones had coverage. They offered the big contracts. The small ones had relationship. So we were right in the middle with that franchise model. We could cover the country with franchise owners, and then we had localized relationships that were the franchise owners that would have that community component and feel. And so that was the major change, taking what worked in both categories and blending that together. And then the only way to accomplish that is with technology. And so our franchising technology was that same model. And so I leaned into those pillars. Then the next step is you create those values in the organization and the model. Then you identify their participants. And so I thought, who are specifically, even more importantly, people that are highly respected in that field, military and police. And so I said, these become our franchisees, right? They know their communities. They're relatable. I know you have a military background, so not everybody's entirely relatable, but most of the people are.
I'm an enigma.
I cannot, I don't know the standards of the Army and their recruiting methods, but, they make mistakes too, I assume.
They lower standards sometimes.
Yeah, understood. So ultimately, they have that community feel, and ultimately that was our primary target. And then you just continue to build on top of that, right? And then instill values, and we create those values, and then as we talk about in our future podcasts, regulate to make sure that you maintain those standards.
Yeah, very good. Now, share with our audience, if there's some new leaders out there, how and when do they need to create something new? How do they know what does that trigger?
So first and foremost, if you are not making progress, right? Leadership is about making progress.
Okay.
So if you're not making progress, you should first evaluate that, right? And then there's really 4 steps that I use to help go through that. The first is if I'm not making progress, I'm going to study it. I'm going to say, why am I not making progress, right? Usually it's process, people, or focus, right? I mean, those are probably 3 of the areas of why I'm not making progress. So I study what is impeding my progress, right? Is it the people? Is it the process? Or is it the focus? And so then I determine, okay, now I've determined which of the 3 it is. Then I'm going to test a new solution, right? Say, okay, one of these 3 have to change. A person has to change, a process has to change, or our focus, or all 3. And then I'm going to test that, right? I think a lot of people say, I'm going to launch this huge business, and they never test it, right? And so if you look at any menu item, right, I'm sure when they go put it on a menu at a franchisor, they had a test kitchen and a localized things, and they changed the flavoring and all that other stuff. So you test it. And you test it in an audience, but a broad audience, right? So you test it in different markets across the country. So, one of the things I always knew, and even as I was developing in my career, that Omaha has always been a test market for different concepts, et cetera. Why? Because we are going to give you honest feedback. We're honest people here that give you honest feedback, whether you like it or not. So ultimately it's like, this is a good test. So we're going to get feedback, and it's largely unbiased, right? And so that's where you test it. So as I launched the franchise concept, I tested it here and said, okay, are these consumers going to respond? We don't have a tremendous amount of security need here compared to other cities and states. And we have a very consistent labor force. So ultimately, within the first couple of weeks of launching this is going to work. Because if I can get it to work in Omaha, I know I can get it to work somewhere else. Then the next stage was offer that. So as I built this business, about 12, 18 months later, I built a business in Omaha, and then we offered our first franchise. And I remember flying to the Phoenix area and going down there, and I said, okay, I remember getting on the plane and leaving my wife that morning and said, okay, this is where really the rubber meets the road, you know, because I know I can make it work in Omaha. Can I make it work elsewhere? Because I'd never tried it, you know? And so we went and offered it. And then within a couple of hours, that first couple of hours, we had our first contract. I was like, this is going to be way better than Omaha. And so then you realize, and this is an example of when you create and test something, you have to evaluate. So we'd done a report that night. And we'd been in Omaha, we're Central Time Zone. And so I went down to Phoenix, and it's on Mountain Standard or Pacific Standard, depending on the time of year. And so then I go the next morning and say, hey, how would you like our report, client? And they said, yeah, except for I thought you were going to come at 10 o'clock to lock our pool, and you came at 11 o'clock. I said, no, we were there at 10, I promise. And the problem was it was not the right time zone. And so these are the things you have to change. And so ultimately that night, we changed the software to make it the localized time zone, of course, and you learn. And so you work out those kinks as you go to your second or third or fourth location as you're creating, and that's where then the expand is the fourth step. So then I began to offer this in other states and other areas, and of course we learned more along that process as that leadership proliferated, and then as you expand, that's where you're going to get that leadership that lasts. Because you can try it on a small scale, you can test it, you can study it, you can test it, you can offer it, but if you do not expand it, it's not going to last.
Very good. Well, that brings us to the end of our time together here, episode 24, season 2, Create. Thank you very much, Reed, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We appreciate you. Next coming up is going to be episode 25, and that is Regulate. So, in the meantime, I'm Art Calderon. Stay purposeful.
Now, if you are a leader that wants to create something that lasts, don't be trapped by offering a new product or a new service. Focus on creating values that will be enduring. Look inside and say, do I embody these values, and are they enduring? The choices you make every single day in any leadership capacity will be evaluated by your followers. So then organizational values need to be clear and embodied by you and then your followers. If you are able to look inside and decide what you value and how you're going to live those, you will create an organization and potentially leadership that lasts.